Good evening, dear colleagues. I'm very happy that you agreed to join today this discussion, and I'm very proud that you found time to join this discussion. And I would like to, before we start, I would like to introduce all colleagues to each other, and I hope that at the end of the discussion we will become a scientific family. Okay, Professor Bruce Leimsidor. Professor Leimsidor, he is a professor at the Foscari University. He's a very prominent specialist in the migration law, and he used to be a chairman of a special office in Vienna, in Austria, and he was in charge of helping Jewish people to come from Soviet Union to Austria and later to United States. Professor...
Also the Iranians.
And Iranians, yeah. Thank you very much, Professor Leimsidor. Mr. Martin Malek, who is the member of Austrian Academy of Defense, and he is a political scientist, a person who is observing the current political situation in Ukraine, and especially in the light of the war with Russia. Mr. Vakhtang Charaia, who is a representative of Georgia, and he's also a consultant to the World Bank. Good evening, Mr. Charaia. Mr. Arie Zaiden, who is the specialist, he's from Israel. He's a specialist in the national defense, and he also comments on the issues regarding world security, special security, which actually comes out the station with the war with Russia. And he's commenting on, let's say, deliberations between Ukraine and Russia on the battlefield. Mr. Dietmar Piechler, he is from Austria, and he is a programmatic director of the Center for Media Literacy at Vienna. And Mr. Piechler is the one who is detecting fakes prepared by Russia propaganda, and he's also dealing with other type of fakes, and he's teaching media literacy, and also he's involved in, let's say, movement of Ukrainians and Belarusians in Vienna. Good evening, Mr. Piechler. Mr. Gunter Fehlinger, who is a strong supporter of EU perspective for Ukraine right now. And I think he will have a really harsh debates with Professor Leimsidor, even though I support Professor Fehlinger, and I would like to get up tomorrow with, let's say, being a citizen of Ukraine, also to hold the European Union citizenship, but I don't know if it will be possible to do right now. But anyway, Professor Leimsidor, as far as I know, has another point of view, but we will discuss. Now I simply provide the hints for our discussion. Alexander Paley, who is a leading specialist in Ukraine, who deals with NATO development, who deals who actually observes relations between Ukraine and NATO. I think since early late 90s, and he published several books about NATO and gave enormous recommendations for Ukrainian government regarding the implementation of the road agenda to join NATO. So good evening, Mr. Paley. Also would like to introduce Mr. Aaron Charpentier, who represents the United States of America, who is an observer at different TV channels, and also he gives his political comments, observations, and he's also a novelist. He published several books. So good evening, Mr. Charpentier. Pavlo Shandra, who is a specialist in the economy, and also he's the member of Odessa City Hall. Good evening, Mr. Shandra. So some other people are going to join us, and while they're getting through traffic jams, let us start the discussion. Mr. Malek, I would like to start with you, since you are a political observer. 3 months have passed since the beginning of the war between Ukraine and Russia. And Russian invasion into Ukraine, Russian aggression towards Ukraine was, I think, for Europeans very, let's say, surprised. Europeans strongly supported Ukraine from the first day of Russian invasion. So what is now the situation in Austria? What is, let's say, Austrian attitudes towards Russian invasion into Ukraine right now? And will Austria support the decision to grant Ukraine a candidate status, which will allow Ukraine to enter the procedure, which will finally lead to the, let's say, acceptance to European Union? Please, Mr. Malek, I would like to remind that, just telling some remarks, I will moderate discussion, so I ask you questions, so please, just 2-3 minutes to give an answer, and other also participants can comment on their colleagues' answers and ask questions. So this will be the live discussion. So please, Mr. Malek, the floor is yours.
Well, this question is quite complicated. Maybe you remember that a couple of days ago, the foreign minister of Austria, Mr. Charpentier, said that Ukraine will not enter the European Union that very soon. And this was, of course, immediately quoted by Russian news agencies. And of course, there was a message in that. These Russian sources wanted to say, what you can see that nobody in Europe is waiting for Ukraine, and that Ukraine basically will not have any chance to get into the European Union anytime soon. And then it was said that this is a misunderstanding, and Austria it does not depend on Austria, because we are not in the European Union. One should we'll have to wait a couple of years, at least a couple of years, and they remind them that there are other candidates for membership in the European Union, for example, Serbia, for example, Turkey, and they wait for full membership already many years. And I do not see that Turkey will join the European Union as a full-fledged member that soon. That will not happen in the next, I don't know, few years. Then you asked what Austria asked for Ukraine. Well, basically, our support is humanitarian. We received, and we still receive, and accommodate Ukrainian refugees. But that's our basic activity with regard to Russia's war against Ukraine. There is, of course, as in a neutral country, there is no military assistance for Ukraine, and this is impossible because our foreign trade laws prohibit to send arms in conflict into hotspots or into countries which are actually involved in military activities. This, however, not in the past. I mean, did not always meant that we didn't send arms at all. We did, but this was illegal. For example, in the 80s, during the first Gulf War, Austria sold actual weapons to Iran and to Iraq. But again, this was illegal, and I do not think that this will happen now to Russia or to Ukraine. And the Austrian armaments industry is quite small now, so I do not think that even if we could legally, that Austrian weapon supply would have any significance for Ukraine. This is not very likely.
Thank you, Mr. Malek. I would like to ask a question from Mr. Paley. Mr. Paley, during the last several weeks, we got to know that Finland and Sweden decided to join NATO, and they will be granted such opportunity. And in the next several months, Sweden and Finland will join North Atlantic Treaty Organization without any membership action plan, etc. During the last 20 years, you were following these deliberations between Ukraine and NATO, and usually we heard from our partners in Western world that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO because we don't fulfill some criteria, so we don't meet some criteria, and usually Western allies talked about corruption. At the same time, they agreed to allow Montenegro to join NATO, even though in Montenegro the level of corruption is not, is not different from Ukrainian one. And at the end of the day, now we understand that simply Western allies, they didn't want to take Ukraine to NATO because of Russia. They were afraid of Russia, etc., etc., etc. So that's why they easily accepted Finland and Sweden to NATO, even though Finland share the border with Russia. What do you think about European integration? We now hear that Mr. Macron, he tries to push an idea of another union where which Ukraine will be able to join. President of Ukraine, Mr. Zelensky, already abandoned this idea because Ukraine wants to join European Union, not other type of, unions which will be loose than European Union. So what do you think? Will it be possible for Ukraine eventually to join European Union, or it will be the same story like with NATO, when we will actually hear about new obstacles which prevent Ukraine to join European Union?
Now we have the situation in which Germany, first time in last decades, support Ukrainian joining NATO. So Germany, Eastern Europe, Northern Europe, and maybe Spain, Portugal, etc. A lot of countries, a majority of European countries, of European Union, support full membership of Ukraine in European Union. So the idea of some other organization, some other structure, which could be parallel to European Union, is not. It is not our choice, and it is not useful at all, because this structure can do nothing for Ukraine, and there is no reason of existence of such organization. So our choice is full membership of European Union, and most important, the most important full membership of NATO, because NATO is security, because security is the main thing Ukraine needs now. So I think that we saw very big change in Europe in the last 3 months. But not in all Europe, only in several countries, and we have a big support for Ukrainian joining European Union and NATO. We saw a very big change in European perspective of EU-Russian relations. So I want to say that the main thing for our country is real changes, not words, but deals. And we had a lot of words during past decades, but now then Ukrainians have a war with Russia, bloody war. We have no time, have no need for only words.
Thank you very much, Mr. Pali. I would like to ask.
I have a question.
Yeah, please.
Well, America has paid roughly more than a third to Ukraine, and countries like Austria and Germany haven't. I understand that there are laws in place that they can't, provide money for the Ukrainian military. But I mean, there are other forms of, there's aid. Like grants. There's for food. There are just other. So I'm just wondering why Europe isn't playing its part economically.
Now it is not time for telling about money, but about security. Ukraine now fight for all Europe, for security of all Europe. If Ukraine fails, and if not win, Ukraine will not win. Very big security problems will take part in different regions of Europe, different regions of world. Because if threats from Russia will be appropriate for Europe, sometimes Russia want European lands, European money, and etc. etc. So Ukraine need firstly weapon now, and as for money, it is Ukraine can earn this money from selling iron, food, etc., etc. So a year ago, Ukraine had rather not very prosperous, but not very bad economy, because we had a rise of our GDP about 3 to 4%, not so bad. And all our problems because Russian aggression especially in the region of Black Sea. So we had not our ways to sell our grain, metal, etc. So we need only roads, we need only free trade today, and not money, weapon and free trade.
Thank you, Mr.
Zelensky said it would cost at least $5 billion a month. So
Thank you.
Between 3 and 5, yeah.
I don't understand how you can say that money's not important, not that important.
After Ukraine will liberate Black Sea, all this money Ukraine will earn not from our own economy. It is only problem of roads, of ways for our trade, not for loans.
Thank you, Mr. Paley. Professor Leimsidor, I would like to ask you the next question. We had numerous discussions when you were in Ukraine, when we were both in Austria, and we had an interview recently, and you always say that Ukraine is not ready to join European Union because of the level of corruption. I would like to say in the beginning that I don't agree with you, but I would like to have an argument with you, because usually when you have an argument with a person, then the truth comes up. So I would like to ask you the following question. You know that you're a great friend of mine, but I would like to ask you the very straightforward question. Is it sounds good to talk about, let's say, the corruption in Ukraine, which obviously takes place, and we know that still there are high index of corruption in Ukraine. Is it really necessary to talk about corruption when we say about European perspectives for Ukraine? Because the same level of corruption which exists in Ukraine exists in Serbia, exists in Montenegro, exists in other states. And some people say that there is also corruption in Bulgaria, there is also corruption in Romania. And from the behavior of some top politicians from Western states, we can judge that the corruption also takes place there. So Ukraine is not the single country where corruption takes place. But from another perspective, Ukraine really fights for European values, for the values which are outlined in a treaty on European Union, the Treaty of Functioning European Union. So we are basically consciously and mentally, we are ready to join European Union. And we see even from the point of Ukrainians' behavior, in European Union, that Ukrainians are ready to join European Union. So is it really fair to talk about corruption when Ukraine actually makes so much sacrifices during the war with Russia, the war which will eventually prevent Russia for, let's say, assaulting some other states like Poland or Baltic countries?
Okay. I'd like to answer your question, but not directly, if you permit. First, it has already been brought up about Ukraine joining NATO. I think we have to be realistic. If Ukraine joins NATO, we're at war with Russia. Basically, because of the contract with NATO, an attack upon any NATO country is equivalent to an attack on all of NATO, and we would be obliged then to become militarily involved in a war with Russia. I don't think anyone really wants this. No one in the West really wants this. The Americans are going out of their way to help Ukraine as much as possible, but to avoid a direct confrontation with Russia. Ukraine's joining NATO would be not just a slap in the face to Putin, but it would be basically the best thing that Putin could possibly want. That is to say, a real confrontation with the West, militarily. It would be obligatory That is to say, a NATO an invasion into a NATO member is an invasion into all of NATO. Basically, this is impossible. This is really impossible. No one is really seriously considering Ukraine's joining NATO. They may talk about it. They may talk about it to irritate Mr. Putin, but really, it is not going to happen. Let's put the whole NATO issue aside. The question of the European Union. If we did not have in the European Union countries such as Poland and Hungary, who have managed to scuttle a great deal of the agenda of the European Union, because within the European Union, the veto of one country within the European Union can stop a great deal of major policy decisions. Ukraine, aside from the corruption issue, let's leave the corruption issue aside. I will not necessarily address your objections in terms of the fact that other countries are equally corrupt. That's neither here nor there. The issue is Ukraine is not stable enough politically. Right now, Ukraine is the victim. Ukraine is basically the good boy of the whole region. Basically, before all of this happened, Ukraine was in a state of relatively constant political turmoil, relatively constant political change. We have already countries like Poland, countries like Hungary, who have managed to really halt a great deal of progress within the European Union. We have no guarantee that after the war is over, even if Ukraine wins, that a positive, humanitarian, legalistic government will prevail in Ukraine. We have no idea what's going to happen in Ukraine after the war is over. This is not the time then to admit into the European Union a country which is really gives us no guarantees, gives us no idea really in the direction that we're going to go. And also, one of the big problems with the European Union is, in fact, once you're in, we can't get you out. The Western Europe would be gladly expel Poland and Hungary from the European Union. They can't do it. According to the Charter of the European Union, it is almost impossible to get rid of a country once they're in. So thereby, this is no time to speak of Ukraine's joining the European Union. Let the war be over. Let the situation stabilize within Ukraine, and then we'll talk. But right now, basically, admitting Ukraine into the European Union is like admitting a blank card. We have no idea what Ukraine's going to be like after it's over. Even if the Russians are totally defeated, driven from Ukraine, and Mr. Zelensky, who is the angel of everybody, very frankly, Mr. Zelensky has done other things which I'm not particularly happy with, but leave that alone. Basically, we have no idea what Ukraine is going to be after the war is over.
Mr. Piechler, please, yeah.
First of all, I do not agree with a lot of the recent comments, and I will explain why. First of all, public opinion matters, and I follow the events and the public opinion in Ukraine since I was at Euromaidan in 2014, and there was a stable, constant support in the population for joining the European Union. I talk a lot with the civil society.
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Joining the European Union, I have no doubt that the Ukrainians want to join the European Union. My problem is whether, in fact, Ukraine is stable enough to join the European Union. I have no doubt whatsoever. What you're saying is true, that there is a great deal of of desire to join the European Union because there are huge advantages in terms of that. But the point is whether, in fact, the European Union will benefit from Ukraine's joining is much another issue.
I think we need a new European Union that is more based on also strategic views, because we have a pro-European population. We have recent polls where there are more than 90% in favor of the European Union. In 2019, that was 3 years before the major escalation of the
Please do not argue against me talking about the fact that the Ukrainian people want to join the European Union. I'm not denying that. I'm saying it's insignificant. It's absolutely meaningless.
You don't think that Ukraine can make any kind of contribution to the EU? I mean,
we don't know what Ukraine is.
What is Ukraine doing right now?
Ukraine is.
Ukraine is fighting for democracy. Right, for the world.
Ukraine is fighting against Russia. Right? Ukraine is not necessarily fighting for democracy. It's fighting against Russia. It's fighting against an illegal incursion into its territory by a foreign power.
But not in the long term. And, there are interests for North America and for Europe, obviously.
Yes, there are interests for North America and for Europe that Ukraine win this war. But what Ukraine is going to look like after it wins this war and after it settles down and after Ukrainian society is rebuilt, who knows? Let it happen. Then talk about joining the European Union. I have no objection to Ukraine.
I agree with that. I think that's reasonable. And I definitely don't think, I know for a fact that there's absolutely no chance, of Ukraine joining, NATO in the middle of a war. I mean, that's just
exactly.
Okay.
Not worth talking about. I agree.
Okay, before I will pass the word to Mr. Piechler, I would like to again to make a short remark, which I think Professor Leimsidor will respond. Professor Leimsidor, you're talking about, let's say, that politically, European Union doesn't know in long term what to expect from Ukraine. But I don't quite agree with you, because in Ukraine, I can't say that we have in Ukraine a political turmoil, because during the last 12 years, we have 3 presidents who substitute one another. So it is very important that each 4 years, one political team goes from an office, another political team comes to an office, and opposition in Ukraine always. What is the let's say the most significant feature of democracy? When opposition has a potential opportunity to become a power, to become a ruling elite, and in Ukraine, always opposition has an opportunity to become a ruling power, and opposition always have an opportunity to have their own free media. Actually, we don't see any opportunity for opposition, for instance, in Hungary, to become a power. And Mr. Orban is in chair of Hungary during the last 12 years. And also in Ukraine, in contrast to Hungary, we have many TV stations which are not under control of the state, which are controlled by opposition leaders, etc. I think that this is let's say, these are the features which prove that Ukraine is on the road to the stable democracy and is ready to join the European Union.
No. Is on the road to a stable democracy? I won't deny. Let it happen. Let the war be over. Give us a couple of years afterwards. So that we actually know where Ukraine is going. This has been a tremendously upsetting and convulsing situation for the Ukrainian people. Who knows what can happen after a war? It is crazy. Regardless of the history of Ukraine before, to take a country in the middle of war and to say this country is in fact a paragon of what we need in the no. Basically, that's unrealistic. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Professor Leimsidor. Mr. Piechler, I would like to ask you the following question. So we heard last week that Mr. Macron was actually talking to Putin. And again, Mr. Macron actually offered something to the president of Ukraine. And as I understand from a President Ukraine speech, that Mr. Macron offers some concessions which Ukraine, in Macron's, let's say, logic, has to make concessions to Russia. Obviously, Ukraine won't do this. Ukraine will fight for all its lands. And I think Mr. Macron can only make concessions for the French territory and not trading Ukrainian territory. So this, Macron is the politician which speaks out from his heart, and speaks very directly. And we know that France usually had these special relations with Russia. But what's about, let's say, Austrian political elite? I started with Mr. Malek about this question. What is your perspective? Will Austrian political elite support Ukraine choice to become a candidate state to, let's say, to join European Union? Even though I remember that recently Ministry for International Affairs of Austria told that Ukraine can only pretend to join European Economic Area, not European Union in general. Is this position an official position of Austrian government, or it's a private position of a Ministry for International Affairs? Please.
Well, that's first of all, Mr. Malek already gave some very interesting comments, which I totally agree. And it's very complicated to answer this question because I think Austrian officials, they didn't make up their mind. I mean, there is, for instance, one foreign affairs speaker from the Green Party. She supports EU access, real EU access for Ukraine. And the Liberal Party supports EU in Ukraine. There are very good people, very pro-European people. And you see that the people who really support Ukrainian diaspora, for instance, when they are protesting against the Russian aggression, they are also in favor of Ukraine joining the European Union. I have to say it's very, very important to lobby in Austria for the EU path towards the European Union from Ukraine. I think also diaspora needs to do more because they were concentrating in the last months to promote the situation in Ukraine, to show the war crimes, to show the humanitarian catastrophe, which is very important. And they did an excellent job. But now it's time to talk about the EU. It's time to talk about what Ukrainians were also fighting in 2014 at Euromaidan, for instance. And we have the Poles, we have the young people, we have the civil society, we have very good examples why Ukrainians want to join the EU, not despite corruption, but because of corruption, because they know that they need European support, European advice to come over these problems that are still existing. There is progress. And to give a brief comment about Austrian politics, I don't agree with our Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Schallenberg, when he said there is no path towards the EU for Ukraine. This was a couple of weeks ago. But after that, he said something completely different. He said, according to the current situation with Russia, we need to think the EU more strategic, not bureaucratic. And this is very important because I think we should accept Ukraine at the moment. We should also accept other countries that are pro-Western, pro-European, public opinion, stable politicians. Serbia is not included because Serbia is a Russian surrogate. It would be a real dangerous country within the EU, but we should accept all the countries that share our ideology, share our strategic view to the world. And I think in these times we need different rules. And maybe if that means that the EU needs to be less integrated in the economic sphere, then it is. But strategy and peace is the most important thing, and we need to stand together.
Thank you, Mr. Piechler. Even though Serbia usually is treated as, let's say, very loyal to Russia, still today, I read that Serbia imposed sanctions against Belarus, and this is also an important sign that, let's say, choosing between a Western perspective and European perspective and Russia, Serbia obviously chose a Western perspective in the European Union rather than Russia.
But just 1 second. But public opinion in Serbia, 35% of the population in Serbia support joining the EU, and in Ukraine it's 80% or 90%. So you see there's a difference, and this is what my colleague before said, stability. We don't have it in Serbia, so it's very dangerous. Sorry.
Can you have cooperation in the EU without trade and without the economy being the cornerstone of its foundation?
I think it's not needed to integrate all economic parts of for instance, we don't use the euro currency in all countries. Sweden, Czech Republic, and several countries have a different currency. So we can we can build an EU with different stages of integration. We already have it. So
you're talking but you say currencies is the only. There's more than currencies, though.
I think it's better to have a union that is more loose, but integrated if it's about security, if it's about support. And we have a kind of support also in the military way. So it's also, if one European member state gets attacked, the other states need to help, and we need to show solidarity. And this is what Ukraine lacks at the moment. We help, but not enough, like you mentioned before. And if Ukraine would be a member of the European Union, the situation would be different. And also we would speak differently. We would support each other differently. So I'm really in favor of that.
May I add, look, in terms of what you're saying, sir, I would have less objection to Ukraine's joining the European Union if, in fact, it weren't the case that each country that sits on the European Council has veto power. As a resident of the European Union, I do not want my future determined in Kiev. I'm sorry.
But I don't want to be determined in Hungary as well, or I don't want the European Union's future to be determined in Austria, because I don't agree with Austrian policy. So sometimes I wish Austria would not be a member of the EU, but Ukraine would be, because my heart is really more in Kiev than it's in Vienna. Sometimes on bad days, really.
But be it as it may, as the European Union stands now, each country has a veto power. Basically, this is the real problem. If that were not the case, I would have much more to say to you and much more in agreement. But given the fact we have Poland and Hungary, who are really acting as blocks to a great deal of progress in what the European Union wants to accomplish, I'm not willing to take the chance on one more country who is really, you may say Ukraine is much more stable than I think Ukraine is, but that's not the issue. Basically, to add a country who does not have a long tradition of democratic ideas, a long tradition, I would be very, very hesitant. But that's because of the structure of the European Union. Once that structure is changed, if it ever will be changed, I see no discussion as to changing it. But in fact, if that were not the case, then basically, fine. We can seriously consider bringing in other countries within the European Union to the European Union. But under the present circumstances, and the fact that once you're in, there's no way of getting you out.
Yeah. Dear colleagues, before I pass the word to Mr. Fehlinger, I want just to stress that If we are talking about democracy presupposes that the pluralism exists, and I agree that there are questions in European Union which have to be agreed and promoted by all member states to be fulfilled. But let's say the majority of questions, they are discussed and decided according to qualified majority system. So it allows member states to have a discussion before they actually adopt a position. And I think that, and now I come to the question which I would like to ask Mr. Fehlinger. Mr. Fehlinger, when Britain left European Union, basically European Union was very, let's say, strict, negotiating with Britain Brexit agreement, and European Union, especially Mrs. Merkel and Mr. Hollande, they and later Macron, they were very strict about the terms for Britain to leave the European Union. And they wanted to show that after Brexit, European Union will receive another impetus for the development, because Britain was really a very serious power in European Union and always had its own view on, let's say, current policy of European Union. But since Brexit, several times we saw different, let's say, voices in the European Union. For instance, even when a pandemic broke in, the first thing which states did, they closed their borders, So they tried to provide this national policy, national epidemiological policy, The same was when migration crisis, where refugee crisis was in 2016. So now I come up to the question about Ukraine. If, let's say, Ukraine enters European Union, can it be an impetus for the development of European Union generally? Because obviously the war which now Ukraine faces, aggression which Ukraine faces from Russia, brings also an opportunity, and not only opportunities for Ukraine, but also opportunities for European Union to display itself as a coherent organization which is ready to, let's say, make a decision on very sensitive questions. So will Ukrainian potential integration to European Union provide an impetus for European Union development?
Absolutely, it will. Thanks a lot. I'm from Austria. My name is Gunter, and I have here the NATO and the EU flag, and it's very meaningful. And they are basically the sisters, the two sister organizations, which the Americans have created after World War II to stabilize free Europe against the Soviet Union and Russian aggression. And this is very meaningful till today. And it's also was very meaningful in the past, obviously, and it was very successful. And we should see both organizations basically as sister organizations. The Russians have weakened us with Brexit, and that was a purposeful strategy of them to break this important Western pillar of EU and NATO out of the Western alliance. And unfortunately, the tragedy happened. But we are now gradually recovering from this shock. We will also manage our relations with the United Kingdom, and we will also be absolutely able to integrate Ukraine in NATO and in the EU. And I will explain how. And it's very important to see that we are a rational organization. It's not that anybody will put Ukraine immediately in NATO or immediately in the EU. It works like this. And that in NATO membership, there's the precedent of Western German and NATO integration in 1955, where Germany was integrated into the NATO in 55. And the same offer is also part of the peace settlement, or it will be not a peace settlement, but an armistice settlement, that Ukraine will have to accept the ceasefire. It can liberate the territories it has basically lost temporarily since the 24th of February, but it must receive to accept the security of NATO membership. So that was basically more or less the situation also with Western Germany in 55. So a complete reconquista of Crimea and Eastern Donbass, it will be certainly not supported. But of course, Ukraine must be secured by NATO, because who else should give a security guarantee than the NATO? And it makes no sense that specific members of NATO give a security guarantee and others not. So absolutely NATO membership of free Ukraine, of the non-occupied parts, is on the agenda. The second point is also for the EU candidate status. Let's be rational. It's various steps here. The first one is it's called the EU potential candidate status. And that will be given to Ukraine on the 23rd of June, according to the latest German newspaper articles, which I have read and I follow all this news. So basically that's the same status like Kosovo and Bosnia have it. That's not the candidate status where you can immediately start to negotiate. That's the potential candidate status where you will get the so-called Institute for Pre-Accession Funding. So it's not meaning that suddenly Kiev will have a veto power on the EU Council and nobody noticed. It is not like that. But they will have a long process, like normally it takes 10 to 15 years. And then we will see how Ukraine is developing, how fast it is performing, and how fast everything will develop in terms of complete acceptance of what the EU is. Because we will make no compromises on that one. Ukraine has to join the political union, like also, by the way, Serbia and anybody else. If you want to join us, then you have to accept what we have already as a regulatory and political achievement. That's, of course, a lot. And so Ukraine has to fulfill that. The moment they fulfill it, they will also be member. And normally, I always say 2029, that's probably too, when we're honest, besides my wish, it will maybe be in the 2030s, but it doesn't mean decades, as Emmanuel Macron has said. So that's the realistic timeline, and that's how it works. And on economics, just very shortly, because it was mentioned, obviously we need to do more, because the Americans do about twice as much now with this 40 billion new package. And all in all, they give about 54 billion already. And we in Europe have all in all now granted 20 billion. So we need to step up. And that's why this new status is also very important, because then automatically there will be more money flowing into Ukraine because of this Institute of Pre-Accession, and also because the closer Ukraine will then get towards the internal market, there will be many also financial assistance possible, like we do already about 3 times more before the war for the Western Balkans per capita, and then we do for the Eastern Partnership countries. So it's very important to change the status of Moldova and Georgia and Ukraine at this new summit on the 23rd of June. And last thing, because I'm an economist, it's also my pet idea, if I may say. So it's very important I drum up a bit of support to also repeat exactly the development model which we had in the Balkans after the post-war stabilization. That is actually what I've written many articles about it, that Ukraine already the last 5 years, but especially now, must exactly follow the economic development model of Montenegro, of Kosovo, of Macedonia, of Bosnia. That means immediate currency adoption of euro. And that is my recommendation. That is joining the EU customs union, because we have so many problems now at the border between Ukraine and the EU with traffic jams and with problems of agricultural goods coming to the European market. We must really very strictly Europeanize, and also ask the Ukrainians, if you really want to be like candidate and very fast, so then adopt the euro, then join the customs union, and unilateral, without negotiations, basically declare yourself a part of the European in regulatory terms, something the Georgians have done, for example, very good. And, it's one thing to talk, you want to be fast in the EU, but the decisions are basically made in the parliament of Ukraine. You can simply today, in the night, you can adopt more EU regulations every week. I've seen how fast Albania works, for example, or Montenegro. Montenegro really wanted to be in the EU, and they have adopted everything without reading, just copy the Croatian language version and go by it week by week, whatever you can do in the parliament, because it's not a negotiation process anyhow. EU accession is not a negotiation where you decide then to change the EU by joining. You basically have to accept what is there, and the faster you accept it, the faster you can join. And that's my recommendation: the euro, the customs union, regulatory alignment immediately. And maybe my optimistic scenario of 2029 is then possible if Ukraine really wants to be in the European Union so fast. Basically, unilaterally Euroize all your economic and political system.
Mr. Fehlinger, I'd like to remind the remark which was made by Mr. Charpentier when he asked a question regarding the support which European Union provides to Ukraine. Obviously, we are very grateful for the support, and especially the way European states actually accept refugees or let's say replaced people from Ukraine because of war. This is very important. But still, let's speak truth. Unfortunately, European Union does not yet provide to Ukraine the funds which would allow Ukraine to restructure its economy. I know that there is also the problem of corruption, it's true, but there is also the ball on the side of European Union. We don't see enough financial support from European Union as we see from the United States. And obviously, when you say about the adoption of euro, yeah, this is a very nice idea, and I would be very happy, let's say, to feel like in Montenegro when euro is your currency. But if Ukraine adopts now euro, it means that majority of Ukrainians will be behind, let's say, the line of poverty, so they become extremely poor, not only because of war, but because of the station with the economy. You can't simply adopt the euro, because once you adopt the euro, the prices go very high. That's why Poland still keeps their zlotys, they don't adopt euro. So we have to be very careful with this. I would like to ask Mr. Charaia, who is a representative of Georgia. As I mentioned in the beginning, he's an expert of the World Bank. We are talking about, let's say, adoption of euro. Let's imagine that Georgia, as a state which wants to join European Union, tomorrow adopt euro instead of Georgian lari. What will it mean for Georgian economy?
Hello to everyone. It's a very complicated question. From one side, it's easy to say that it will help Georgian economy, but I would not say it will be so easy. First, the implementation process itself, and second, the management of the economy, which is not part of the Eurozone. And if you will assign euro as a local currency, it will cause a lot of difficulties, I believe, because you can't manage your economy with the currency of another country, which is not assuming you as a member of its own coalition, so to say, Eurozone. So to manage your own economy, especially when there are a lot of problems with the inflation, global chain supplies, a lot of different problems, regional problems such as Russia-Ukraine war, global problems, global pandemic, and who knows what will come next. So you need your own monetary policy to manage your economy. So if you only implement the euro and if you will not be part of the European Eurozone, then I believe it's a tricky way. It will be like an advertisement, which looks nice, but in reality, it's really hard to manage the process in such a way. Also, I want to say that there were a lot of ideas about should Ukraine join EU or NATO, and in general, I agree with those people who say that it's really hard to take Ukraine, or I would say the same for Georgia as well, the country into NATO or into European Union, which is more or less stable organization and which don't want to destabilize itself. Yes, from one side, I understand it totally, but from another side, I see that something is wrong with the modern system of stability. global stability? Will it be through EU, NATO, UN, or any other international organizations? Nowadays we have a war in Ukraine. Ukraine is fighting for, I would not say instead of European Union or instead of NATO or for their goals, but they sacrifice a lot for the peace, security, and stability of those countries which are in those organizations, more or less. And when those organizations tell you that, yes, we understand that you are doing a lot, but we can't compromise our own stability, and you have to fight for some more time. It will be months or it will be years. And after some time, when you will finish the war and maybe a decade later, maybe I will help you with joining and becoming more stable countries like that. From one side, as I said, I understand this position, but from another side, it's really hard to understand and really hard to accept that the world today is powerless, or that the world today can't do enough to support the country which the whole world understands is fighting for the truth. And it's not an aggressor. The Ukraine is not an aggressor. It was attacked, but and it's not country somewhere. It's a country next to the European Union, within the European continent, and the biggest country in the Europe as well. So the world today is fighting the number one country in the world in terms of its territory. The biggest country, Russia, is fighting with the biggest country in Europe. And despite the fact that Russia is an aggressor and everyone accepts that this country is aggressor, the world can't do enough against Russia, and even to support Ukraine properly. So I don't know how and how long it will take, or through which, using which instruments it should be done. But the fact is that that nowadays the world is not ready to be democratic enough or the powerful enough to keep the stability and to support those who are on the right side of the global event, which is currently happening in Ukraine. So I don't know how, but I believe the world should do much more for Ukraine and against Russia at the same time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Charaia. I would like to ask Mr. Pavlo Shandra, who is the member of Odessa City Council from European Union, European Solidarity Party. Mr. Shandra, you heard this. You heard this discussion, and obviously, I think this discussion is very fruitful. And I think that generally this discussion couldn't take place 4 or 5 months ago, because I would like to remind that 4 or 5 months ago, when Ukraine tried to push on the agenda of the negotiations with the European Union a possibility to sign a new agreement, a possibility to progress in the relations. Usually Europeans, they put the finger on the treaty, on the cessation, and usually they were telling that Ukraine has to fulfill all opportunities that a cessation agreement provides. But after, let's say, after the war break in, after Russia started the war against Ukraine, and after Ukraine efficiently fights with Russia, then obviously European Union started to change its mind. So what is your perspective on the situation with EU-Ukraine affairs?
Dear colleagues, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to such a distinguished audience. I heard here different opinions of the and position to Ukraine. And I prepared a small speech showing my position and my opinion. I would like to emphasize that Ukrainians are fighting courageous for the European values outlined in the Treaty on the European Union and the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union. In 1993, the newly emerged European Council adopted Copenhagen criteria, which the applicant state has to meet in order to join the European Union. These are the rules that define whether a country is eligible to join the European Union or not. These three criteria are: first, stability of institutions guaranteeing democracy, the rule of law, human rights, and respect for the protection of minorities. Second, it's the existence of functioning economy and as well as capacity to cope with the competitive pressure and market forces within the union. And the third one, it's the ability to take the obligations of membership, including adherence to the aims of political, economic, and monetary union. I think that in the beginning of the 1990s, there was a false concept that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, democracy would become a universal form of the state development. So they did not pay enough attention to the newly emerged independent republics and the pace of their development. From one side, they failed to tackle the emergence of the dictatorship in Russia, and from another hand, they did not support to full extent European choice of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia. From the beginning, the European Union was ready to grant membership to the Baltic countries, but it hesitates to provide the same opportunities to Ukraine. And let's speak from the heart. The European Union considered Ukraine as a part of the Russian influence. I think it was a very, very big mistake. Ukraine proved several times during the last two decades that we deserve to become members of the European Union. We had Orange Revolution of dignity, and today we have war against Russia. We displayed many, many times that we are Europeans in our nutshell. I think that European politicians have to keep their word and provide Ukraine the candidate status on the road to the European Union. It will help us to become a member, and this will, I'm sure this will stop the war sooner. And also, Ukraine has to become a member of the European Economic Area. It will help to rebuild Ukraine after the war and bring prosperity to Ukraine after the devastation. Thank you very much for the opportunity to give my speech.
Thank you very much, Mr. Shandra. I would like to ask Mr. Aaron Charpentier, who is the citizen of the United States, and obviously United States, many people forget that many people forget that originally Marshall Plan, which was adopted by United States and later executed by Organization for European Economic Cooperation, was created in order not to only to rebuild European states, but also to help them to overcome, let's say, differences and try to act in a, let's say, a uniform manner, try to find their common ground on different issues. And the first Secretary General of European Organization for European Economic Cooperation, Mr. Robert Marjolin, was the one who tried to manage, let's say, all requests of 16 member states, participants of this plan. And if you look to the Marshall Plan, U.S. congressman stated that by executing Marshall Plan, European states eventually can create the same entity as the United States did, back in the late 18th century. So, Mr. Charpentier, what is your perspective on the situation with the Ukrainian desire to join European Union? What, from your perspectives, what for European Union will be to get Ukraine to the board, to get Ukraine inside European Union, how it will help European Union, how united Europe will look like if there will be Ukraine?
I think, first of all, I think that, for instance, Henry Kissinger said that every country will develop in its own way, and every country will be slightly different. We as Americans can't expect other countries to believe and emulate everything that we say and do, and we can't expect them to be, something like another American state. And I think that the war will really inspire. As I said in the last interview, I think that Ukraine will retain a lot of its traditional culture, and as they should. But I think that once Ukraine is part of NATO, Ukraine will adopt a lot of values that they lack now, that are European values. I think that Ukraine already does have a lot of European values and North American values. And you see Ukraine fighting for a lot of those values now. And I think that there's some prejudice involved in not allowing Ukraine to join the EU, to say that Ukraine won't be European enough, or, you just, as I said before, you can't expect Ukraine, Ukraine's an Eastern European country, and it always will be. It doesn't have to share the same exact values as, say, Germany or Britain. Germany or Austria or France. So I think that there are European values, and there are every country has its own values, and I think that as long as Ukraine adopts a lot of the main values in the EU and in NATO, that's the most important thing, as long as Ukraine can really function within those organizations. But to expect Ukraine to be exactly like a lot of other countries, when a lot of countries in the EU are very different in the first place, it's just, it'll never happen. And you can't expect that. I think that, I think my country expects other countries to adopt all of its values and a lot of its culture. And I just think that that's wishful thinking. It never happens. It can never happen. As long as a lot of the countries that we gave assistance to and helped develop, embrace some of our core values, then that's important, but yeah, that's what I think. I think that it will take, I think it will take a lot of years before Ukraine becomes part of NATO.
I think
it's not a waste of time to talk about it right now, because it's a long process, right? And it's something that needs to begin early.
Thank you, Mr. Charpentier. Mr. Paley, I would like to ask you regarding Poland. Recently, President Duda, he declared that there are no more borders between Poland and Ukraine, and this was a very strong statement because Poland really provide an enormous support for Ukraine. Moreover, Poland really as an example how, let's say, European states have to assist Ukraine in fighting Russia, and Poland does it best for Ukraine. And
there were several Eastern European countries that provided a lot more assistance than a lot of the Western European countries that really have, an opinion, but no economic backing.
I would like to ask Mr. Paley regarding the possibility for Ukraine, Poland, and Baltic countries to create some type of union. I think that many colleagues remember about the Visegrad Group. But actually, the Visegrad Group did not become really fluent organization, maybe because Hungary was included in this organization. But now we see that there are many things which unite Ukraine, Poland, and Baltic countries, especially because Baltic countries, they used to be inside Soviet Union. They were occupied by Soviet regime, and Poland was also occupied by Soviet regime, and they understand Ukraine very much. And what do you see? Do you see any perspective for us, for these 5 states, to create a union which won't be, let's say, a union instead of European Union, but which will supplement for Ukraine European Union? And what do you think about perspective for establishment of the union between Ukraine, Poland, and Britain? Since before the war, there were talks about the possibility to establish such type of union.
Poland is old friend of Ukraine, and this country is in the same boat with Ukraine, because Poland knows that a Russian crocodile will not eat them. Some countries of Western Europe think that Russian crocodile will eat them at the last. But Poland is a country which in the same boat with Ukraine. So it is very big friend of Ukraine, but real union is NATO. And if we see now some obstacles of joining NATO. Some people say that it is long way for Ukraine. I want to say that for Finland and for Sweden, it is not long way. It is very short way for them. As for obstacle of democracy of Ukraine and stability of Ukraine, I will say that as of stability, now Ukraine is very stable country. For about 19, maybe 99% of the people support legitimately elected government now. Support armed forces of Ukraine, and we have no any disturbances, any meetings, etc. We have not that, and political differences even. So Ukraine is very stable. As for democracy, I want to say that Ukraine is very democratic country, and maybe even more democratic than EU itself. For example, I am historian, and Ukrainian, a half of 1,000 years ago, all officials in Ukraine, from the top level to lowest level, were elected on the elections, free elections of people. So the main obstacle for Ukraine joining NATO and EU even is fear of Putin. But I think that it is not very appropriate for big NATO, for big Europe to fear Putin if not so big Ukraine don't fear him. Putin is not dangerous for strong. It is very dangerous for little girls, for little for children, but not for big European Union with 500 million people and with NATO. It is not dangerous for them. And Putin is not even dangerous for Finland. As for, I hear about the fact that Ukrainian joining NATO will be slap on the face of Putin. But joining Finland is even more like slap on his face. But it will be this joining NATO of Finland maybe in 2 months after this day, maybe 2 or 3 months. This slap Putin will hold on his face. So I want to say that Western world, if it want to survive, it have to not to fear and not to fear old persons. Not so dangerous for strong. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Pillay. Mr. Malek, very prominent novelist Orwell used to say that in his novel Farmland, he used to say that all animals are equal, but there are some animals which are equal than others. And obviously, we understand that despite the equal treatment, there are different treatment which actually different European states face. And maybe that's why our Ministry for International Affairs, Mr. Kuleba, he published an article in Foreign Affairs I think last autumn, where he asked Westerns to stop to consider Ukraine as a post-Soviet state, and he actually called Europeans and Westerns generally to abandon this concept of, let's say, a post-Soviet sphere of geopolitics. What do you think after this war with Russia? We understand that CIS, which existed after the collapse of Soviet Union, CIS is now also collapsed because actually this union between the former Soviet republics now don't function, and after Russia tried to invade Ukraine, obviously all member states of CIS, they will be very reluctant to engage in any affairs with Russia, you know. So what do you think about this post-Soviet area? Do Westerns ready to abandon this concept and consider Ukraine as a truly European state and not a part of a post-Soviet area?
Well, that's a good question. I think that Europeans will sooner or later have to accept Ukraine as a self-sufficient state in the future member of the European Union, and not as a part of the so-called post-Soviet space, which by and large existed 3 decades. Somebody of the colleagues, unfortunately I do not remember who, said that Ukraine, as all the other former Soviet republics, were considered as parts of this notorious, I would say, post-Soviet space, and therefore as a part of Russia's so-called zone of special interest or special influence. And this lasted 3 decades. And the European Union, and I would say as well as the United States, conducted some kind of a Russia First policy. And this Russia First policy failed totally. And I would even say that the Russian First policy was, of course, not the only reason, so to speak, the only cause of Putin's decision to attack Ukraine, but one of several, or maybe even many reasons for him to take this very, very bad, or I would say savage decision. But from my point of view, the concept of the so-called post-Soviet space should have been abandoned a long time ago. It should have been abandoned at least eight years ago, when Russia, as a matter of common knowledge, annexed Crimea and unleashed its war in Donbass, in eastern Ukraine. But now this concept of the post-Soviet space has totally lost its meaning. I mean, it's by and large totally senseless, and should be replaced by something else. But the problem was, and to a certain extent still is, that the European Union did not want to be a kind of geopolitical player. And Russia capitalized on this. Russia made use of this fact. The European Union did not want to deal with geopolitics. The European Union was not created to do so. And it is quite huge and has a lot of members. The European Union found it very, very difficult to adapt to this new security environment, demanding that the European Union becomes some kind of a special, of a geopolitical player. By the way, not only because of Russia, but because of China as well. Because these powers mainly act as geopolitical powers in the world, in Europe as well. And therefore, if European Union does not, to a certain extent at least, should be ready to act as a geopolitical actor as well, it will be very, very difficult, if not impossible, to counter Russian, not only influence, but aggression, war, and Chinese influence, political and economical as well. To be honest, I do not know whether the senior officials in Brussels are aware of all that. But I would even pose the question as that the European Union has to become a geopolitical player, or it will, well, of course, it will not be dissolved, but it will lose the significance, and Russia and China will not take it seriously.
Thank you very much, Mr. Malek. Professor Leimsidor, I would like to ask you the same question regarding the abandoning of the concept of the post-Soviet area as a, let's say, geopolitical concept which existed in Brussels. Will, after this war, this concept automatically be suspended?
I think, I tell you, I would like to go back a few comments before, where you mentioned the question of the Visegrad Group, because I think this is a very, very important issue. Right now, the last several years, the European Union, one of the major problems with the European Union has been the effects of post-colonial migrations from the sub-Saharan Africa into Europe and from the Middle East Middle East and South Asia into Europe. The major problem in terms of this has been in terms of the equal distribution of migrants and refugees across the European Union has been the Visegrad Group. And you basically said Ukraine will be a member of the Visegrad Group. Basically, this alone, my friends, from a point of view of someone interested in the questions of migration in Europe, has to be very, very wary of what this would mean. Poland and Hungary have blocked the European Union's capacity for being able to distribute migrants and refugees throughout the European Union in some sort of equitable way. They're blocked in the Mediterranean countries where they in fact land in the European Union, and they can't really move out because Poland and Hungary have blocked any sort of policy. Ukraine will join this. I cannot imagine the Ukrainians being willing to take their fair share of Black people, of Muslim people, of people of non-European backgrounds, just as Hungary and Poland have also blocked the situation. This has put the European Union in an extraordinarily difficult position, aided the development of the far right in Europe. Mrs. Le Pen, Mr. Salvini in Italy, all of the far right people are linked with Poland and Hungary in terms of this. This has been an incredibly destructive element, and basically Ukraine is going to go right into that situation, even in terms of the non-Europeans who were in Ukraine who are fleeing from the war. The Ukrainians are giving them trouble in the border. They're not letting them out because they're Black, because they're Muslim, because there is a serious problem with non-European peoples. And basically, we're in a phase in European history where our conventional ideas of what European means are very, very different. Thereby, instead of talking about the whole question of the CIS, I think we have to talk about the question of what Europe means and what we need to do in Europe. And the joining of Ukraine into the Visegrad Group would be a disaster, would be a major disaster.
Thank you, Professor Leimsidor. Mr. Fehlinger, you wanted to comment on Professor Leimsidor's words, as far as I understand. We don't hear you. Please switch on.
Sorry. First of all, if we want to be taken serious as European Union, then with Ukraine, it's much easier because we will be much more powerful European Union of all in all 37 member countries. We will have 600 million people once the Ukraine is into the European Union, the Balkans, and the United Kingdom comes back. This is the way to achieve strategic European Union. It's with Ukraine. That's very important. The second point is to the professor who is a bit critical to Ukraine. Of course, nobody has any appetite on a second Kaczynski Poland. Yeah? That's I have told my Ukrainian friends very clearly. But Ukraine is not in that direction at all. Ukraine is very pro-European country. I always provoke them to be a bit more pro-European, it's true, to adopt the euro, to join the customs union. And it's true, yes, there is, of course, a strong kind of orientation towards Poland, but it's also logically because it's such a very close neighbor. It's a so similar country, and they obviously are helping now in this war so much. So, of course, they look very much. But Ukraine, I always tell them, please, Ukrainians, don't go the Polish way because Poland is 30 years ahead. You have to go like the Western Balkan countries and reform in that manner. and also to reject the question of nationalism, because I lived in Ukraine many years, 4 years actually, and there was no problem with racism. There were a lot of students from India and from Africa in the Ukraine universities, that there were incidents at the border now is related to the war and to the crisis, but there is no racist tendencies in the Ukraine society.
Can you imagine Ukraine taking in large numbers of African and Asian migrants?
Actually, interesting fact that Ukraine is a very multicultural and multi-ethnic society, which I also didn't know before I came. We have pockets of Greek population, of Syrian population, of Italian population, of Albanian population. We have them traditionally from before the Soviet Union.
All white. White.
Okay, that is obviously true. That we have even parliamentarians who are black in Ukraine, and we don't have a single black parliamentarian in Austria. So when you see that, we have, of course, issues. We are not so multicultural, multiracial society like the United Kingdom or France. No country is, not even Germany, Austria, none in the Eastern Europe is. But Ukraine is a particularly very open-minded country. Many of the business people in Ukraine are from Syrian descent, for example. They came 30 years. Many people who were students in the Soviet Union, they were staying basically after 91 in Ukraine and became very successful businessmen from Nigeria, from Syria, from the ex-socialist brother countries. So there is really, to my best knowledge, no real significant problem, which is, and actually, to be honest, the problem in Hungary especially is much less one of racism, but it's much more one of Russian massive influence buying, because Orban was relatively reasonable until in 2014 he opted fully for the Russian money, and he is now a paid foreign influence agent. It's less of a problem of internal politics of Hungary. It's more of massive Russian influence in the European Union, where Putin on purpose buys the politicians like Schröder, like Schüssel, like Orban. In Poland, he was less successful, but Fico, for example, in Slovakia, and also Borisov in Bulgaria, etc.
Is the fence that Orban has built across the border to prevent people from coming in to Hungary, is that part of the situation?
He has built a fence,
totally and absolutely illegal in terms of international law.
You will not hear me defending Orban. I just attacked him as a Russian asset, and that's what he is. There is no doubt about it. But it's not that this is a
asset.
Absolutely. He has opted for the Russian nuclear plant in 2014. He has opted for the cheap Russian gas deals in 2014. He has opted for the Gazprom Corporation. He's blocking now, today, he's blocking the gas and the oil embargo. And this is a real major issue of influence buying from the Russian state in a European state, where he basically not only buys him, but he blackmails him as well. So it's a double kind of control situation of Orban, and it's a big problem, I agree. But it's not the problem of Ukraine. Ukraine is a victim of Orban. Orban has blocked the NATO accession of Ukraine and the NATO cooperation since 2015. They wanted to have a very closer status and opening these working groups, and Orban was blocking all of this, with some fake argument of mistreatment of the Hungarian minority in Transcarpathia, which is absolutely invented situation. And so it's absolutely an issue of Russian influence in Hungary and in some other member states, which we very significantly have to fight.
And Poland?
And Poland, Poland is not a pro-Russian country. There was efforts, but they have not done that. But of course, they have a very specific problem in Poland with their identity, with their pride. They are also a very powerful country. And I'm very critical to Mr. Kaczynski. But you cannot really then say because of Mr. Kaczynski, there should be a problem with Ukraine. The Polish, we have also not treated so well in the European Union. And we have actually, I make this argument as well if you want to know, the Polish do nothing else with the nomination of judges like the Austrians do regularly. I can tell you exactly the party political affiliation of all Supreme Court judges. And then we made a big issue out of them politically nominating the Supreme Court judges. Yeah. That was very questionable as well, but I don't want to be a defender of Mr. Kaczynski because I'm very critical. Since 15 years, I attack him for being anti-European and very dubious in many ways. Yeah, but nevertheless, this is a debate internally we have in Europe because we have not reformed the European Union as to a strong enough federal union. But we cannot then blame this on the Ukrainians.
No, but the question is, I am very, very dubious that Ukraine will not join also with Hungary and with Poland and with Slovakia in terms of blocking any sort of equitable distribution of migrants and refugees throughout the European Union.
Look, the Visegrad, I understand your concerns, Professor, but the Visegrad is in principle nothing bad. Yeah? This is a regional group, like we have the Nordic Council, like we have the Benelux countries, the Baltic councils. There's not the Regional Cooperation Council in the Balkans. That's something good. Yeah? That then after 2015, it became so xenophobic, and they didn't want to take refugees. The Polish have always said, also after 2014 already, that they took 1 million Ukrainians into Poland. And it's true. They have really been very generous, very open and very good already in this crisis, which Europe, most of the Western European, tended to ignore the 2014 crisis. And that was a big mistake of our side. And the Ukrainians have been generous wherever they could. And they are not in this kind of xenophobic modus which the Polish were in these years. So I wouldn't worry too much, especially after this crisis.
Let me speak on the xenophobia. So I don't mean to use my own experiences, but, I lived in Ukraine for a year and 4 months. I lived in Odessa, and Odessa is really multicultural in a lot of ways. It's a lot of Muslims.
Try live here.
A lot of Jews. And nowhere. Let me finish, please. Nowhere in the world, including my own country, have I ever seen Jews and Muslims, brown-skinned Muslims, get along so well. There are also a lot of Turkish people that come over to Odessa. There are a lot of African students in Odessa. There are a lot of, I was actually very surprised with all the diversity in Odessa.
Odessa is very atypical. Very, very. Basically, it's recognized that Odessa is totally atypical in the sense.
It's one of the biggest cities, right? It's a very big city, bro.
It's not
a small city.
It's right?
But Professor, now it's 3.5 million Ukrainians, or it was up to 5 million. They are in the European Union and they receive help because they are refugees from the war. And I think this is a tremendous experience for these people because they will come back also with a completely new attitude towards Europe and understanding. And they will certainly not be xenophobe after it. They will be certainly very happy to help other people as well because they have been through this terrible experience of being chased away. So I would not worry about anything like this. It will be a very open and a very modern society, Ukraine, actually, especially emerging now out of the war, out of this disaster. It will be very European Ukraine coming out of it.
And I said some of that in one of my other interviews. And the war will definitely change Ukraine. And I believe for the better. I have absolutely no doubt about that. It'll take time, right? A lot of changes will take time, but I think that, here in America, Americans are not only very supportive of Ukraine, but they really, I see a lot of admiration. And I mean, really, really deep admiration. A lot of Americans calling Zelensky a hero. And I think that, I don't know what Europeans' opinion is of Ukrainians, but I can tell you that Americans really admire strong people, smart people, and determined people. And I'm in awe.
Thanks a lot, actually, for American support, because without America, Ukraine would be lost.
I wanted to make a short remark. This situation which you, Mr. Fehlinger, just mentioned about 3 million Ukrainians who left Ukraine because of Russian invasion, this is actually a very, very important remark, just, glancing on Ukrainians' behavior in European Union. So first of all, many Ukrainians, they found job in European Union. Many Ukrainians, they came from Ukraine with financial resources to spend in European Union, which is also more important. And I know many Ukrainians, obviously I don't have statistics, but I know many Ukrainians who went to European Union, and they already came back, for instance, to Odessa or to other cities. And this is also crucially important. So it means that Ukrainians who come to European Union, some of them, they are willing to stay, but a majority of Ukrainians, they're ready to come back because they feel more secure. They have more opportunities, as they think, in Ukraine because it's less regulated, etc. And this is also important. I would like to remind you that 6 years ago, when Ukraine was received visa-free regime 6 years ago, there were many concerns that there will be many cases when Ukrainians violate visa-free regime, etc. But maybe I'm wrong, but as far as I know, 6 years passed from that time, and we now can say for sure that Ukrainians don't violate visa-free regime, and there are many opportunities for Ukrainians, and Ukrainians use in a correct way visa-free regime, which means that even if Ukrainians tomorrow, let's say, or Ukraine become a member of European Union, it won't mean that Ukrainians will violate EU regulations or will play with EU, because Ukrainians are very well observed in let's say in European Union situation, European Union pace of life. Mr. Piechler, what is your impression in Vienna? You have many connections among Ukrainians, among Belarusians, etc. So what is your impressions about Ukrainians, what Ukrainians in Vienna are talking about, what is their actually mood, and how quickly actually Ukrainians observe in the society? So institutions always play a big role, even if you're talking about fighting corruption. So how can you assess the behavior of Ukrainians who actually reside in Austria, for instance? We don't hear you. Please switch on microphone. Yeah, thanks.
First of all, I want to mention, I think 6 years ago, I was in Russia, in a small city close to Moscow. I don't recall the exact name. I wanted to see something. It was a kind of a study trip to understand the country, especially after the aggression in eastern Ukraine. They were recruiting everywhere. They were recruiting fighters to go to Donbass. And I was in a small town, in a little bit in the east from Moscow, so it was 3 or 4 hours by train. And these Marines, they had this anniversary day where they get all drunk and go to the fountains and behave like crazy. And I saw something that I never seen before in my life. They attacked a black man who was wearing an advertising around his, so he was actually a living reklama. Yeah, the Russian speakers will understand what I mean, and the Germans, the Austrians as well. Yeah, we also use this term. And fortunately, some woman in a shop called the police, and then the perpetrators let off the victim. I was many times in Ukraine, several cities, and also I visited many universities, and everywhere around the country I saw students from all over the world, also black students. We know there is a black MP who is a boxer, who is very famous, and I posted something in the chat section. So Ukraine is a different country regarding that aspect, at least in Russia for sure. It's still Eastern European, and it's still different in Western Europe. But okay, the world is different, and we need to understand that. But if we take a look how the Tatars, for instance, are accepted in Ukrainian society, how Ukrainians respect Turkish people, yeah, and even I try to educate somehow Ukrainians that Erdogan is not a nice guy, and there are huge problems in the Turkish society regarding human rights and women's rights. But Ukrainians say, no, I never had problems with Turkish people, and I find that very inspiring. So it's very different to Poland. And about 2015, I was demonstrating myself against far-right groups. The far-right groups were always also pro-Russian. I was demonstrating against people who were demonizing all refugees. I was helping also so they get some clothes and everything. But I have to say, it's not easy to take millions of people from completely different societies with really different worldview. And it's not like, and this is what I think, they have a different education about human rights, women's rights. They have a different cultural background, a different cultural civilization. But we did it because we wanted to help. Maybe not everything worked well, and maybe there are a lot of problems. And I take these problems as a kind of collateral damage. But this is the same with Ukraine joining the European Union, because I think we have even maybe less problems because the cultural differences, the political differences are less huge than, for instance, with people from Chechnya or Afghanistan. So I don't see this point as a huge problem. About the diaspora here, I think they integrated very well. Recently, I asked my friend, I told her we need some Ukrainians who are here for 40 years. Yeah, it was before the war, because we need the old Ukrainians, the ones who migrated a long time ago. And she said, you will not find them because they are already Austrians. They say, yeah, I have this babushka in Ukraine or something like that, but they are very much integrated into the society. And they find their identity during the war. But beside that, I think they are very eager to the European values. They are very tolerant people. And it's very seldom that I meet somebody who reminds me of this, let's say, Russian attitude about Europe. This is really, I think, 1% of diaspora has these worldviews. And I want to add one more point. It's the same with the Polish diaspora. They are here for a much longer time, and they are also super integrated. They are super Austrian, and they are very tolerant and liberal people, and they have nothing to do with this Kaczynski ideology. So, yeah, I can say,
I think though that has as much to do with Austria as it does with the people coming in. Very frankly, I lived in Austria for 25 years, and I found Austria to be a relatively accepting and integrating society, much more than I had expected. In fact, because my grandfather came from the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I speak German, and I would tell Austrians, I can't really understand this, but because I'm not really an Austrian, I'm not really, and they say, nonsense, you're more Austrian than we are, you're more Viennese than we are. That happened to me all the time in Vienna. I live in Italy now, and I've lived in Italy for a long time. The Italians would never say that to me, but the Austrians do. So what I'm saying is a lot of that, what you've just described, is as much to the credit of Austria as it is to the credit of the migrants themselves.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that before the war, I used to go to one of the members of European Union. I don't like to mention which state in particular, but just to give you an example, for instance, when I was in one of European countries, let's say members of European Union, I was at the bus station and I was approached with, I think, some criminal intention because of my Jewish nationality at the bus station in the late night. I wouldn't mention the country, a member of European Union, but this country is a member of European Union. So why I'm telling you this, being a Jewish, obviously I don't have any problem in Ukraine. Nobody put a finger on me because I'm Jewish. So that's why I want to emphasize that Ukraine, in this regard, is extremely hospitable. Ukraine is extremely tolerant society, and in Odessa there is a huge medical university, and each year thousands of students from India, for instance, come to study medical practice in Odessa. Later, the majority of them go to the United States. They come to Odessa because education is cheaper than in the United States bachelor program, and they feel quite comfortable in the city. So that's why I think that Ukraine, from my own perspective, from my own experience, etc., is an extremely tolerant society. We will soon finish the discussion. I hope that during the last 10 minutes, Mr.
There's also something that I'd like to add too, that I found that, and I'm digressing a bit, but we were talking about Ukraine being open-minded, and some of us said that Ukraine isn't open-minded, but I found Ukraine to be much more open to free speech than my own country. I mean, by far. I really think there's no comparison. I think with all the political correctness in my country these days, it can be difficult sometimes to really say anything without getting into trouble. And if you have a lot to lose, if you're famous, or if you have a lot of money, I mean, you could lose everything, or you could lose a lot. And you could lose a job. You could lose your job in America. Just for saying certain things, even for just looking at a female the wrong way. And in Ukraine, I just felt you feel a lot more free in a lot of ways. I have to say that there really isn't a lot of political correctness. Ukrainians are straight. They'll just say something, they'll just say, in America, we have an expression, they just say it the way it is, and as an American, I always just felt, I was in one country, I won't mention the country, I was told to go back home, American, they swore and told me to go back home. But, I always felt completely at home in Ukraine.
Thank you. So I would like, to offer close remarks, let's say, for the discussion. Let's try to be very succinct. So, Mr. Charaia, you just followed the discussion, you participated in the discussion. So just very briefly, your government, that now there's a very tense relations between the Ukrainian government and the Georgian government, because the Georgian government does not, show intention, let's say, to assist Ukraine. Obviously, Georgian government supports sanctions against Russia, but we don't see as much intent to help Ukraine as, for instance, Poland display. Georgians, when I say this, they say that you have to understand us. We are not a big state, and we depend upon Russia. I understand these positions, but still, Ukrainians would like to see more support from Georgians than we actually receive. What, in terms of, let's say, European perspective of Georgia, year ago, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia established a Betonik declaration, according to which we three countries have to follow the same road to European Union. But now it seems that Ukraine will get sooner this candidate status, on the status which is most like a candidate. So what is about Georgia? What is a discussion in Georgia about, let's say, candidate status?
First of all, let me comment on Georgia-Ukrainian government. How they, I would say, bite each other because of political reasons, I would say mainly. But in reality, in practice, Georgia is really supporting Ukraine in all fields, I would say, except military one. Will it be diplomatic or economic fields? Georgia is totally supporting Ukraine against Russia and blocking Russian intentions, which would be aiming to avoid sanctions which are imposed on Russia. So I have no questions and no doubts on that regard. But because of different political reasons, there are not, I would say, much and not enough friendly environment between the governments of Ukraine and Georgia. But if you take the Georgian society, ask any Ukrainian who is in Georgia right now. There are tens of thousands, more than 20,000 to be more exact, IDPs from Ukraine in Georgia, including people which are studying at Georgian schools, at especially renovated, so to say, Ukrainian classes in Georgia. How do they feel in Georgia? How Georgians are supporting them? So me as a Georgian, I totally support Ukraine, and probably more than 99% probably is supporting Ukraine. So no doubt in that regard. And I believe sooner or later the governments of Georgia and Ukraine will find the common language, so to say, and there will be no questions in that regard. About the second part of your question, could you please specify it, because I did not got the real essence of the question because of the voice interruption.
About candidate status, so my question
yeah. Because the candidate status. So Georgia is trying to become a EU member for a long time. For some period of time, we were trying to be to become a part of the EU. To be part of EU is sounds really loud. I would say that the efforts which Georgia was doing to be closer to European Union, to get different advantages from the European Union, as well as to show its support to European Union, was really active, and it is continuing also now. I don't believe that because of Russia-Ukraine war, Georgia will become EU member sooner than it would be before the war. It would be expected before the war. But I believe that the status of the candidate of the European Union, Georgia is really able to get it, and it will be a great step forward for Georgia, because it will allow Georgia to open new instruments for its economic development. We already have visa-free regime. We have free trade agreement with the European Union. And step by step, I would say that Georgia can become a member of European Union one day. But here I also would like to say that I don't really believe that the goal should be to become EU member state. Of course, it will be a great advantage for Georgia and great benefit for Georgia. But I would like to say that if Georgia will achieve the higher standards of in terms of economy, democracy, stability in general, then joining EU is not a primary and ultimate goal. There are many countries in Europe which are not EU members, but their life standards are not less than average EU member countries one. So I believe knowing that no one will accept you within few years within the European Union, the right position for Georgia will be that to get maximum advantages from being a partner of European Union, doing maximum you can do yourself, and with right movements and with pragmatic policy, one day maybe Georgia will become EU member. But before that, I believe that there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of directions where Georgia can improve its position. And this moment is a good moment to achieve all those opportunities. So for Georgia, for Moldova, as well as for Ukraine, I believe this moment should be used properly by the governments of these countries.
Thank you. And colleagues, I ask you to be slightly succinct in the end of our conference. So, Mr. Piechler, very succinct question, and I hope for a succinct answer regarding Belarus. And I think this is an important question. I'm sure that Putin would not make a decision to launch an offense against Ukraine if Mr. Putin, if, for instance, there was no situation in Belarus 2 years ago when there was massive riots in the streets against Lukashenko, but Lukashenko managed to tackle with these riots. And Ms. Tikhanovskaya, whom you know personally, she had to flee, and now she resides in Lithuania. We remember this case with Mr. Protasevich, who was detained and taken out of the plane, and it was horrible. Actually, now nobody talks about Protasevich, but moreover, now people are talking about lifting up sanctions against Belarus in order to get Lukashenko allow for a grain to enter European Union through Belarus. Because Russia put a blockade against Ukraine in the Black Sea. So my question will be, do you find the policy of European Union correct towards Belarus? Because from my point of view, either European Union had to buy out Lukashenko because European Union has more money than Russia, or European Union had to do anything which is in European Union disposal to simply to push back Mr. Lukashenko. So now what we see from European Union, this is a very strange, very frustrating position towards Belarus. So what do you think?
Well, that's very complicated because I remember that in 2020, Belarusian people, they did not choose Lukashenko. Yeah, so it's not like Putin who made some cosmetical changes to the election results, because we can say that at least we can assume that Russian population, unfortunately, because of disinformation, several reasons, ideology, they elected Putin. But Lukashenko, because of many reasons, because of his bad way of doing propaganda, he's not very competent in this. He doesn't have this perfect organized propaganda machine like Russia has. He was not elected anymore. The economic situation was decreasing, and Belarusian people, they did choose to not vote for him, and we have a lot of evidence for that. For instance, diaspora voting in Russia. So we can assume that that the Belarusians living in Russia are not very pro-Western, or at least not especially pro-Western. So the population in Belarus does not like Lukashenko anymore, and that gives it a very dangerous situation, because I think there is no escape for them. They are even if Ukraine is at war, Ukraine has a chance, because they have a government that they elected. President Zelensky is president of Ukraine. Lukashenko is not. He's actually a puppet of Putin. And the European Union can they can ignore the fact, and they can try to do some kind of appeasement policy towards Lukashenko to bring him out of the orbit of Putin. Maybe strategically that would make sense, but I want to remind all of us, they did this in 2014 to make Minsk a negotiation ground with Putin, then Poroshenko and Lukashenko. But first of all, it didn't work. And secondly, I want to say Ukraine was very, very brave to attack Lukashenko after the fake elections, and Ukraine took a stance against him. They said he's not elected president. We support Tikhonovskaya. We support the brave people of Belarus, and they were very brave. The whole world did not expect such a huge rallies and everything. And if Ukrainians were brave enough in that situation to stand up for human rights for the Belarusians, then how could the EU say no? Because of geopolitical reasons, we try to divide impera, like the Romans said. So I don't think so. But it's very hard. And I heard Ukrainian voices, I will not mention who, that told me maybe it was a mistake. Maybe we should appease Lukashenko more so the situation would not escalate that much. Maybe we should appease Lukashenko more. Maybe we should make more business with Russia. And I'm not talking about pro-Russian Ukrainians. I'm talking about frustrated Ukrainians who are suffering from the war, actually very patriotic ones who was just having a background discussion with me. So that's a very difficult decision, but I think from an ethics standpoint and from a moral standpoint, both the EU and Ukraine did the right thing to condemn Lukashenko. He's a terrible dictator, and I will take one thing into the discussion. I think it's about Lukashenko, who is even a dangerous influence for Putin, and Putin is a terrible dictator. Don't get me wrong, yeah. But Lukashenko has a huge grief against Lithuania, against Poland, and I think that could make the situation even more tense if it would be about Putin alone. So I don't see any bright future for Belarus.
Thank you. Professor Leimsidor, final remarks.
This has just been very, very useful and very helpful. I will, in fact, make it clear that I am not necessarily in principle against Ukraine joining the European Union. I'm against a precipitous joining of the European Union, which in fact was the question. That is to say, should Ukraine entry into the European Union be speeded up? No, it should be normal procedure. And basically give the situation time. But I am not necessarily against Ukraine joining the European Union. I am against any sort of precipitous action in this sense.
I think everyone here agreed with you.
Mr. Fehlinger, please.
On that point, yeah. Anyway. I'm sorry.
We don't hear.
Thanks a lot. Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot. The real task is how to open the European Union, because that's very difficult. So if Ukraine is clever, it would be leading an alliance of all the 9 countries which are realistically trying to join the European Union. I made the case already, the 6 Western Balkan countries, Georgia and Moldova. Mr. Zelensky leading this group of countries and fighting together to be in the European Union. Unfortunately, what he's doing, he's fighting with Moldova, he's fighting with Georgia, he's fighting with all the others, and he's not really building an alliance. And the really good thing is, invite all of them to Kiev, all other 8 countries, and say, we are the new Europe. Please give us voting rights. Please open up Europe because we are Europeans as well. That would be the smart thing to do of Mr. Zelensky. And I hope he will now adopt this strategy in the next 6 weeks, because to really get a positive decision for Macedonia and for Albania to start the negotiations, for Kosovo to get the candidate status, and for Bosnia to get the candidate status, and for Georgia and Moldova and Ukraine to get the potential EU candidate status and IPA funding. This is far from certain, because we have Macron who is opposing it. We have the Dutch who will second him, who are the Germans. We are not sure that they really will have this political agreement. And we have also Orban who is completely against it. So we are far from certain from winning this debate. So it would be much smarter of Mr. Zelensky to form a big group and to open Europe together.
Thank you, Mr. Charpentier. Final remarks.
I have nothing to add. I would like to just thank you for inviting us. This was really constructive. It was interesting. It was, I enjoyed it. And I'd also like to thank my esteemed colleagues for this, for making this happen. And I hope we can do something like this again someday.
Thank you. Mr. Malek, please, your final remarks.
Well, I have always, as a political scientist, of course, my politician, and I have no intention to become one. But as a political scientist, with a specialization on conflicts in the former Soviet Union, I was always a big supporter for Ukraine's European Union membership bid. I think that one of the biggest mistakes the Ukrainian people has made in its entire history was that it elected Mr. Yanukovych president in 2010. Because without that, we would not only the Ukrainian, but also European, and now because of the war, global history would have been taken a different path. We would live in a different world, and without Yanukovych, Ukraine now maybe it would not be a member of the European Union, but it would be much closer to full-fledged membership than it is now, because, dear colleagues, let's call a spade a spade.
Mr. Malek, I'm very sorry for interrupting you, but I think that actually Yanukovych, even though he's a traitor, he betrayed Ukraine, he's the one who provoked Orange Revolution and Revolution of Dignity, and he's, I think, the single president in the world who were ousted from power 2 times. So I think that we actually have to thank him that he was so horrible, Mr. Yanukovych, that Ukraine decided to make a very radical European choice, because Yanukovych was so horrible that we didn't have another option.
Okay, but without Yanukovych, I think that without all the to us well-known events, there would have been no annexion of Crimea. There would have been no war in Donbass. Well, we do not know what would have happened without Yanukovych, but the events as we know them are horrible enough. But I wanted to say that we should get rid of our illusions, if any illusions should have been present among us. During a war, a full-fledged war, the Russian military aggression, it is very, very unrealistic that any serious European Union accession talks, about membership already, can start. This is very, very unlikely. But whether it would be desirable is not that clear. If you are in a very, very difficult situation as now is in Ukraine, and you do not even know what will happen tomorrow, it makes really no sense, not from Ukraine, not from the Ukrainian side, and from the European Union side, to start any talks about membership.
Exactly.
And therefore, I think that it is really necessary to wait for the end of the war. And but there are a lot of serious people who already said, politicians and political scientists and others as well, who said that maybe this war will go on not only for months, but maybe for years, in the worst case. Of course, I hope that the war will end tomorrow, but this will certainly not happen. Even if Putin should die today, which will not happen as well, even in this case, the war would not end. Therefore, well, let's wait for the end of the war, and then get into and if Ukraine should be victorious, in another case, well, would be such a mess that the Ukrainians will have totally different problems, I'm afraid, than membership in the European Union. But let's say Ukraine will be victorious, or it will at least survive as an independent state, and then get into serious membership talks with the European Union, because earlier it really doesn't make no sense.
Thank you very much, dear colleagues, for participating in this discussion. I think it was very fruitful. Thank you very much, dear colleagues.
Let me just add one more thing. I do think, though, that it's I think it's good. I think it's a good thing, though, to show Putin to like at least go through the process, even though it's impossible that Ukraine will join NATO at this point. I just think it's just good. I think that it just angers Putin, and it just really pushes his buttons.
Yeah, I agree with you. Actually, probably follow Mr. Alexei Arestovich comments, who is the advisor for the head of office of President Mr. Zelensky. And I agree with his point that if Ukraine obtains now the candidate status, it will actually mean that the war between Ukraine and Russia will enter another field, because then Russia will fight the country which is a candidate to European Union, and it means that the war will actually get another context, and for Russia it will be very difficult to, let's say, continue this war. Because Ukraine will be in another status. But again, who knows? We will have, I think, another opportunities to, let's say, emerge in this field of discussion. Thank you very much, colleagues, and thank you very much, audience, that you followed this discussion. Thank you.